Hello and welcome to another video review, and one that I've actually been wanting to do for quite a long time now. This is The Legend of Zelda, originally released for the Famicom and later the Nintendo Entertainment System in the West, and it's been ported to quite a few other systems since then. And what you're seeing in this video was recorded from the Nes Classic Edition. This is an action-adventure game developed and published by Nintendo that was first released in 1986 for the Famicom and saw release on the NES the following year, and it has gone on to become one of the most influential games ever made. While the action-adventure genre did certainly exist prior to this, it was really this game that solidified what we know as the genre to this day, and while it has seen some alterations here and there and we've added a bunch of subgenres to it, let's be honest, when you think of the term action-adventure game, the Zelda series is going to be one of the first things, if not the first thing that comes to your mind when you're looking to get an idea of what they're talking about. Now, of course, the image that's conjured in your mind may not necessarily be this particular game when you think of action-adventure game, and a bit more specifically, The Legend of Zelda as action-adventure. But regardless of whether you instantly think of, say, Ocarina of Time, or in my particular case, A Link to the Past, or if you've only gotten in the series very recently, maybe Breath of the Wild, they are all built on the formula that the original Legend of Zelda established. And while there have been some slight deviations over the years, and there have been a couple of spin-offs that really have nothing of anything to do with this particular style of gameplay, like, say, Link's Crossbow Training or Hyrule Warriors, you can take a look at every single major entry in the Legend of Zelda series after this one and see exactly where it traces its lineage right back to this. And that ultimately brings us to a few questions. Obviously, we know the game was a huge success back in its day, but the more important question now is, how does it still hold up? I mean, it has been almost 35 years ago as I'm recording this video that the game was originally released. In the grand scheme of video games, that was a long time ago, and a lot of things have changed since then, so we'll be of course looking at it to see how well it still holds up after all this time. The next thing to consider is that we already know the game was a massive success when it originally released, both critically and financially for Nintendo, but it went beyond simply being a successful video game that also established a successful franchise that continues to exist. It was ultimately the game that redefined the entire action-adventure game genre into the definition that we all still use today. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, bearing of course in mind that this game did release almost 35 years ago as I'm recording this video, which means that it has aged very heavily over the years, and some of it not for the better. This is an NES and Famicom game, which means that you have to make allowances for a very limited color palette, as well as very limited graphics capabilities, and as long as you keep those limitations in mind, you find that the visuals in the original Legend of Zelda actually are quite good and still hold up reasonably well. It is of course all 8-bit pixel art that's pretty bright and colorful, and they've done a rather good job of making sure all of the colors line up with pretty much what you would expect everything to look like, except in the case of the actual enemies that you'll be fighting, which are either meant to blend in a bit with the environment in certain instances, but not all, or the colors are used to be a quick visual reference for how tough an enemy is compared to others of its type. Now, of course, there's not much in the way of animations, with all of the sprites only having a couple of frames of animation, and it really only being enough to indicate that something is happening, but of course by 1986 standards, that was fairly normal, so it wasn't that big of a deal. It has aged a bit poorly in that regard, but the rest of the actual artwork ends up aging quite well because it is that old school 8-bit pixel art, and it was done well enough in its day that over the years it has aged into a pleasantly retro feel as opposed to a lot of other games of the era which just look archaic. And when you move over into sound design, it's a pretty similar story, where all of the sound effects are those 8-bit beeps and bloops that you've come to expect from games of the era, and while they certainly get the job done, they're nothing impressive. Although, unlike some other games of the era, they don't make your ears bleed. There is one sound effect that's really annoying, and that's when you're at low health, it just has this constant beep, but even that is not especially loud, so it ends up not being a particularly big problem. Then you move on from the sound effects. There's no voice acting, so there's nothing to cover cover there, but then there's the music. Now, there's not a lot of music in the original Legend of Zelda. In fact, if you string the entire soundtrack together, including just the very brief tunes you get for either picking up items or solving puzzles, you get roughly 8.5 to 9 minutes of music. And within that span of music, you've got a rather nice, ominous, and mysterious dungeon tune, a particularly ominous final dungeon tune, a credits tune that admittedly starts out a bit weak but eventually starts to get a bit catchy, and a particularly catchy tune that starts out the game with a call to adventure and proceeds to continue that call to adventure with a faster paced version of it when you're running around on the overworld, which has subsequently become the main theme for the entire Zelda series and has also become one of the most iconic theme songs in the entirety of gaming, and it never fails to put me in a good mood, which for an old grumpy eldritch horror like myself is saying quite a lot. And much like with how the visuals have aged rather well over the years and have that distinctly pleasant retro feel to them, the music also has that going for it, so it ends up working out pretty well across the board as far as presentation goes, both when compared to its contemporaries and when you look at it even almost 35 years later. The thing is that not everybody likes those old school graphics and sounds, so your mileage may vary on that. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. Although this being a game from 1986, there's not really a whole lot in the way of story here. In fact, what passes for a story in this game was actually pretty poorly translated when it was brought over to the West, so it doesn't really help matters that all you get in the opening crawl is that the Prince of Darkness named Ganon stole the Triforce of Power, and in an effort to prevent him from getting hold of the Triforce of Wisdom, Princess Zelda split that Triforce into 8 shards and scattered them around the land of Hyrule, and it's up to a hero named Link, who you play as, to assemble all of the shards of this Triforce of Wisdom and use it to defeat Ganon, save Princess Zelda, and bring peace to the land of Hyrule. It's very simple and straightforward, and really doesn't have a whole lot of bearing on what you're actually doing throughout the course of the game. I mean, sure, it gives you some basic context for why you're doing what you're doing, but when you get into the game and actually start playing it, you find that there's no cutscenes. The text that does come up is mostly just hints on how to progress, or comments from shopkeepers on how they want you to buy something, or something they have is expensive, or, of course, it's dangerous to go alone, take this. And even when you do manage to finish the game, you end up rescuing Princess Zelda after defeating Ganon, and she just says, "Thanks, Link, and you're the hero of Hyrule, and there's peace throughout the land now," thus ends the story. It is clearly an extremely simplistic storyline that is only there to hold the basic concept of the game together, and thus you end up focusing entirely on the gameplay and not really giving much of a crap about the story at all. And to be fair, that was the norm of the era. We weren't seeing a whole lot of complex storylines in really anything because they just didn't have the storage space for it on the game cartridges, or if you were playing on PC, the hard drive or the discs themselves, depending on what your system was set up with. So it's not really something you can hold against the game in the first place. This of course does bring us to the gameplay, which is the most important part of The Legend of Zelda, and the part that surprisingly holds up pretty well across the board. Now, for those of you watching this video who may not actually be familiar with the original NES or the Famicom, understand that on that controller you only had a D-pad for navigating up, down, left, and right, as well as a select button, a start button, and an A and B button. Obviously there wasn't a lot to work with the controls, so they had to keep things fairly simple for most of the games on that system, and The Legend of Zelda is no exception. The game takes place from a top-down perspective, and you move Link around using the D-pad in up, down, left, or right fashion, and the A and B buttons are both bound to different inventory slots. Now, the A button is always bound to your sword, you can't change that, but the B button is bound to your inventory items, things like the bow and arrow, or the boomerang, or something along those lines. When you're on the name entry screen where you can select your save slot, the select button will switch between the various options, and then you hit the start button to actually select it, and when you're actually in game, the select button simply pauses the game. If you press the start button while you're in the game, it will bring up the sub menu where it'll allow you to select your inventory item as well as see how many Triforce shards you have, and that also pauses the game in the process. And apart from the name entry screen having that oddity of having to use the select button to switch between the options, The rest of the controls actually work out very well for the game because they're very simple and very easy to learn, and you don't even actually need to be told the controls to be able to figure them out within the span of only a few moments. And with the controls out of the way, let's go ahead and actually talk about the mechanics themselves. Now, this is a very simple and very early example of what we know today as an action-adventure game, but all the elements that we've come to expect from the genre are present and accounted for. You're going to be spending most of the game exploring the map and trying to find all the various dungeons and complete them in order to get the additional items you'll need to progress, as well as collect all of the Triforce shards before you eventually go to fight Ganon himself. To that end, you have the overworld and you have the dungeons. Now, the overworld is the main map of the game where you're going to be wandering around a bunch of forested areas, deserts, and what have you, and you're going to be fighting a bunch of monsters along the way. You do this through the use of certain weapons that you'll have available in your inventory, as well as, of course, your basic sword. Now, regardless of whether you have the basic starting sword, the upgraded sword, or the magic sword, which is the best one in the game, you actually have two basic attacks. The first of them is your straightforward melee attack, and then the second is the sword beam, where it actually shoots a projectile out across the screen. Now, because you can only have one of those projectiles on screen at once, you can't just keep spamming the sword beam over and over and over again. You have to wait a brief moment before you can shoot it out again, but as long as you have maxed out health, it will just continue to be able to do this. Once you lose at least half a heart of health, then you are no longer able to use the sword beam until you've maxed out your health again, so you'll be wanting to try to find a replacement heart or a fairy which will restore a large number of health points, or even find your way to a fairy pool which will heal you all the way up, or you can use a potion from your inventory in order to max out your hit points. Red potions have two uses, whereas blue potions have only one use. Of course, those potions are pretty expensive, so you'll be wanting to save those until you really need them. In fact, especially early on in the game, you'll want to be pretty careful with how you spend your money, because when you get rupees, which is the in-game currency, you're going to either get them in 1 rupee increments or 5 rupee increments, the 1 rupee being just the orange and blue flashing one, and the 5 rupee being just the solid blue one. And while they are the most common drops from enemies, unfortunately the drop rate in general is actually quite low, so you're going to be finding a lot of the time they won't drop anything at all. If they do drop something, chances are it's probably going to be a rupee, and most likely going to be a 1 rupee increment. And if you need something else, well, good luck with that. Now, your best chance for finding a lot of rupees is going out of your way to explore as much of the map as you possibly can, because there are certain hidden areas that actually have stashes of rupees in them. And when you go into those areas, you'll find an NPC who says it's a secret from everybody, and it just gives you an amount of rupees. You can use these rupees to buy a wide variety of things. Once you gain access to the bow, you can buy arrows, which will actually allow you to use the thing in the first place. And once you've done that, when you go to start shooting enemies with the bow and arrow, it actually ends up using rupees as ammunition, which is a bit odd, but it does work in lieu of an actual dedicated arrow count. Aside from that, you can also use the rupees to buy an upgraded magical shield, which will allow you to defend yourself against more advanced attacks than simply the rocks that the Octoroks shoot at you. Or you can buy things like those potions I mentioned earlier, or the blue ring, which is a very expensive item, but once you get it, any damage you take from then on out will be halved. So it's definitely a very nice item to have, even if it is expensive. But by far the most useful item you'll find in the shops is the bombs, which will be able to blow open walls or blow open boulders or whatever the case may be to access new areas, and you can also use them offensively against enemies, although you do have a pretty limited amount of them, so you need to be careful with that. Aside from the items that you'll find in the shops, you'll also find several items in the dungeons. For example, the bow is actually found in the dungeons, and the arrows have to be purchased in the shops. But aside from that, you'll have things like the raft or the step ladder, both of which you find in the dungeons and allow you to traverse new areas, as well as additional weaponry like the boomerang or the magic boomerang, which is just an upgrade of the standard boomerang, and that allows you to actually pick up items from a distance as well as stun enemies, so you can go up and whack them with your sword or whatever the case may be. And by and large, the items that you find in the dungeons are considerably more important than the items that you'll find in the shops, although some of those items in the the shops are either required or are just very nice to have. And despite a lot of the games of the era not really explaining much about the items that you have access to and which ones are actually required versus which ones are not required, The Legend of Zelda actually does a pretty good job of giving you hints when you actually need them from the old men in the dungeons who will give you hints on how to defeat the bosses or certain secrets that you might need to find, or more importantly, visual cues that will give you a bit of a hint on how you can get to an area that you may not be able to get to at the moment. So for example, with the raft, where you might come across an area that looks a lot like a dock and you'll think, oh, well, I don't have a boat yet, so maybe once I get access to a boat, or in this case a raft, I'll be able to go through that and actually get to some area that I need to get to, and that's exactly what happens. Of course, that's not to say that the entire game is intuitive and well hinted at. There are certain instances where you'll go into an area and have basically no idea what you're supposed to do there, or there'll be certain areas where you actually need to access a secret in order to be able to progress, and when those sorts of instances come up, it really just ends up being a matter of trial and error. Just try whatever you think might work, and eventually something might actually work. You might need to blast a hole in a wall, or you might need to push a block around, even though you don't necessarily think you can do that at first. But while the game may not necessarily explain how it works, it does give you ample opportunity to mess around with it and find out what does work. Unlike most games of the era, it's actually pretty forgiving on the player. Whenever you end up dying in a dungeon, you actually start right back at the beginning of the dungeon as opposed to starting back at the beginning of the game, although that's not the case if you die on the overworld. Unfortunately, in that case, you do start at the beginning. Unlike other games of the era, however, it doesn't start you back from square one. It may start you in that location, but you retain all of the things that you've unlocked up to that point. All of your inventory items, all the rupees you had. In short, all of the progress you've actually made is retained even after you do end up dying and starting back at either the beginning of the dungeon or in the starting location on the overworld. The only things that are not retained are the fact that all of the enemies you've defeated will respawn, so you're going to have to fight all of them again, except for, of course, boss enemies, and the fact that no matter how many heart containers you have, you're only going to start with 3 of them filled. Now, of course, if you're in the overworld, that's not that big of a deal because the starting location is really not that far from a fairy pool that you can fill all of your hearts back up at, but if you do that in a dungeon, then you do need to be pretty careful about it because that can make your run quite a bit more difficult. And that does bring me to something important to talk about, which is difficulty. A lot of games from this era are especially difficult to new players, but The Legend of Zelda really is not. It's a game that's pretty elegant in its simplicity and being able to ease the player into figuring out exactly how to play it without being overbearing with tutorials or even really giving you that much of an adjustment period. You actually don't need much of an adjustment period with this, because the core mechanics are simple enough that you're going to be able to grasp them within mere moments, and the more advanced concepts are shown to you in such a way that you don't really need to worry about them as much as you might think. The thing is, it's not every advanced concept that you're going to be able to instantly grasp. There are certain ones that require you to either think outside the box or maybe get a bit of external help, whether that be somebody simply letting you know that there is a certain mechanic or giving you a bit of a hint on how to progress, or even seeking a walkthrough entirely. The thing is, going the walkthrough route, at least on a first playthrough, is going against the spirit of the game. You might want to go through it and get the secret areas later on, but the first time through is really meant to be an adventure. You're supposed to go in there and explore and figure things out for yourself and have an adventure. And the original Legend of Zelda is really one of the first games where you're actually able to achieve that. You're exploring strange locations, you're solving puzzles, you're fighting monsters, some of which are especially big and dangerous monsters. You are ultimately saving the land and becoming a hero. And this is one of the earliest examples of a game where not only can you recognize that that's what you're doing, but it actually still holds up pretty well to this day. Admittedly, the puzzles you're required to complete are extremely simplistic, but to be fair, it's a game from 1986 on the NES. There's only so much they could have really done with that. And that's actually the big takeaway from the original Legend of Zelda. Conceptually, it was actually ahead of its time. It was pretty forward-thinking, but the problem was they were limited by the platform and what they could actually do with it, So they basically had to make the best of what they had, and what they ended up doing was basically establishing the template for what we recognize as action-adventure games to this day. Sure, it is a very primitive example of this, but it does have all the elements that we've come to expect from action-adventure games. It has an action-based combat system that takes place in real time. It has a large map to explore that is full of secrets that you can uncover. It has numerous puzzles that you have to solve, even though those puzzles are very simplistic in this particular entry. And while it didn't really play as much of a role in this particular game due to the limitations of the platform, the story is still present and it does still hold the game together. It would obviously become much more important in later action-adventure games when the capabilities of the genre were further realized by advances in technology. And while it may not necessarily have been the very first game to combine some of these elements, it was one of the earliest examples of a game that not only combined them, but did them rather well for their time. And because it was so successful at doing that in its day, it basically showed the entire world that, hey, action-adventure games can be a thing and they can be done well, and as the technology improves, who knows where this genre can go from here. And thus, the original Legend of Zelda more or less served as the basic template for what we would recognize as action-adventure games from then on out. Really, all of them that we see up to today can trace their lineage back to this particular game, whether it be directly in the case of course, the Legend of Zelda series, or spiritually in the case of other games like, say, Darksiders. And while later Zelda games would certainly refine this formula and expand upon it and make it a lot more palatable to more modern audiences, the original Legend of Zelda is still a very playable game, and as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty much a must-own. It's part of that collection of fundamental games, one of those titles where you absolutely must play it at least once, because it's just that important to the entire history of video games. And especially if you like action-adventure games, then it's one of those titles you absolutely must play, sort of like how the original Doom is an absolute must-play for fans of the first-person shooter genre, or Super Mario Bros. Is an absolute must-play for fans of platformers. There's just certain titles in video gaming history that were so important that they really shaped the way things would evolve from then on out, and the original Legend of Zelda is one of those games. So if you haven't played the original Legend of Zelda yet, I very highly recommend you do so, and if you own a Nintendo Switch, you can actually get it included with part of the Nintendo Online subscription, along with a bunch of other NES games that they've bundled together. Just make sure you're careful when you go into that menu and select it, because there's actually two of them in there. One of them is the original version of the game, and the other one is the SP release, which is basically a remixed version of the game. You'll be wanting to play the original version first, and if you've already played through the original and you might be seeking a different challenge, if you go into the name entry screen and enter the name Zelda, then it will actually start the second quest, which is more difficult than the main quest, and moves a bunch of things around, and also expands some capabilities of certain items that were not especially useful in the main quest, but which have a much better role in the second quest. It doesn't change the story up or anything like that, but it does give you some replay value. But whether you're playing the game on the original NES hardware or the original Famicom hardware, if you happen to have one of those, or you're playing one of the re-release versions like, say, the Game Boy Advance version, or maybe the version that was included in the Zelda collection on the GameCube, or more recently things like the NES Classic, like what you saw in this video, or through the Switch Online service, the original Legend of Zelda is still a timeless classic, and is one that absolutely everybody who plays video games should at least play once. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel in some regard, whether that be getting additional games for review or additional equipment to make recording games easier, or whatever the case may be. If you can't do that or don't want to, then that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.